My name is Sarah, and I'm 28 years old, though I feel like I've lived 100 lifetimes in these past few years. People always expect bruises when you talk about being broken by someone you loved. They look for visible scars, purple, marks on your arms, a split lip, anything tangible they can point to and say, there, that's abuse. But what happens when the wounds are invisible? When the person you trusted most never laid a finger on you, yet somehow managed to shatter every piece of who you thought you were. I'm sitting in my tiny apartment now, the one I finally found the courage to rent 3 months ago, and I'm trying to make sense of how I got here. How someone who never hit me could leave me feeling more broken than any physical blow ever could. The silence in this place is different from the silence I lived with for 4 years. This silence is mine. It doesn't carry the weight of unspoken threats or the tension of walking on eggshells. It's just quiet, and somehow that terrifies me more than the chaos I left behind. Marcus was never violent in the traditional sense. He never raised his hand to me, never threw objects, never even raised his voice above a certain controlled level. That somehow felt more menacing than screaming. He was methodical in his destruction of me, precise like a surgeon removing parts of my identity piece by piece until I couldn't recognize myself anymore. The worst part is that he made it seem like Love Dot. It started so gradually that I didn't notice it happening. Like how you don't notice your hair growing until someone points out how long it's gotten, or how you don't realize you're gaining weight until your clothes don't fit anymore. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, until one day I woke up and realized I had become a stranger to myself. The girl who used to laugh loudly at movies, who wore bright colors and had opinions about everything, had somehow disappeared without me even noticing she was gone. The first time I should have recognized what was happening was when he suggested I might want to think more carefully about my outfit choices. We'd been dating for 6 months, and I was wearing a yellow sundress to a barbecue at his friend's house. Nothing revealing, nothing inappropriate, just a cheerful dress that made me feel pretty and confident. But Marcus had this way of looking at me, the slight frown that made my stomach twist with anxiety. And then he'd say something that sounded like concern but felt like criticism. I just think you might get more respect if you dressed a little more conservatively, he said, his hand resting on my shoulder in what anyone watching would interpret as affection. You're so beautiful, Sarah, and I hate the way other men look at you. I'm just trying to protect you from their wandering eyes. At the time, it felt romantic. Here was this successful, handsome man who loved me so much he wanted to shield me from the inappropriate attention of others. I changed into jeans and a loose sweater, and the smile he gave me felt like validation. I was being a good girlfriend, considering his feelings, making him comfortable. The voice in the back of my mind that whispered this wasn't right was so faint I barely heard it over the sound of his approval. Looking back now, I can see that was the moment the foundation started to crack. Not dramatically, not with any fanfare. Just a small fracture that would eventually split wide enough to swallow my entire sense of self. But I was 24 and in love, and I had no idea that love wasn't supposed to require you to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's vision of who you should be. The changes continued in small increments. He never demanded anything outright, never issued ultimatums or made threats. Instead, he used disappointment like a weapon, wielding his hurt feelings with surgical precision to reshape my behavior. When I wanted to go out with friends, he wouldn't forbid it, but he'd get this sad, wounded look and talk about how much he'd been looking forward to spending the evening with me. When I expressed excitement about a promotion at work, he'd congratulate me with enthusiasm that felt just slightly forced, then mention how much pressure I must be under and how worried he was about my stress levels. Asterisk. The isolation happened so slowly I didn't even realize it was happening. Marcus never told me I couldn't see my friends or family. He was much too smart for such obvious tactics. Instead, he used a combination of scheduling conflicts, subtle criticism, and emotional manipulation that made me choose isolation myself, believing it was my own decision. When my best friend Emma invited me to her birthday dinner, Marcus reminded me that it was the same night as his company's quarterly meeting, which might run late, and how much he'd been looking forward to cooking dinner together afterward. He looked so disappointed when I mentioned Emma's invitation, talking about how rare it was for us to have a quiet evening at home lately. I found myself calling Emma to cancel, making excuses about not feeling well, and spending the evening waiting for Marcus to come home while scrolling through photos of my friends, having fun without me. The pattern repeated itself over and over. My sister's graduation party conflicted with Marcus's need for support during a particularly stressful week at work. My college friend's annual reunion weekend coincided with Marcus planning a romantic getaway for just the two of us. Each time, the choice appeared to be mine, but somehow Marcus's needs always took precedence, and I began to believe that prioritizing his happiness over my relationships was what love required. My world grew smaller and smaller until it revolved entirely around Marcus and his needs, his schedule, his moods, his preferences. I stopped making plans that didn't include him because the disappointment in his eyes whenever I suggested independent activities was too painful to bear. I stopped talking about things that interested him because his polite disengagement made me feel foolish and boring. I stopped wearing clothes he didn't compliment because his silence felt like criticism. The most insidious part was how he framed all of this as caring for me. He worried about my friendships because some of my friends were negative influences who didn't understand our relationship. He was concerned about my family because they seemed to stress me out during visits. He questioned my choices not to control me, but because he loved me so much, he wanted to protect me from making decisions I might regret. Every limitation felt like love, every restriction like protection, every criticism like guidance from someone who knew me better than I. Knew myself. Asterisk work became my only refuge, the one place where I could still access fragments of who I used to be. I was good at my job, competent and respected, and for 8 hours a day, I could pretend I was still the confident woman I remembered being. But even that sanctuary began to erode under Marcus's influence. He started asking detailed questions about my workday, wanting to know about every conversation, every meeting, every interaction with colleagues. Initially, I interpreted this as interest in my life, proof that he cared about my career and wanted to be involved in all aspects of my world. But the questions became increasingly specific and critical. Why had I agreed to lead that project when I was already so busy? Wasn't it unprofessional to laugh so much during team meetings? Did I really think my boss respected me, or was he just being polite? His concerns seemed reasonable on the surface. He was helping me navigate office politics, offering perspective on situations where I might be too trusting or naive. But slowly, his interpretations of my workplace relationships began to overshadow my own perceptions. When my manager praised my work, Marcus suggested he might have ulterior motives. When a colleague invited me to lunch, Marcus wondered aloud whether I was being taken advantage of by someone who just wanted help with their own projects. I started doubting my professional instincts, second-guessing conversations and interactions that had previously felt straightforward. The confidence I'd built over years of career success began to crumble as I internalized Marcus's suggestions that I was misreading situations, being manipulated by colleagues, or failing to recognize when people were taking advantage of my good nature. The final blow came when I was offered a promotion that would require occasional travel. It was an incredible opportunity, exactly the kind of advancement I'd been working toward for years. But when I told Marcus about it, his reaction was immediate and devastating. He didn't say I couldn't take it. Instead, he talked about how much he'd miss me during travel, how worried he'd be about my safety in unfamiliar cities, how difficult it would be for our relationship if my career required so much time away from home. He cried that night, holding me close and telling me how proud he was of my success, but how scared he was of losing me to ambition that might ultimately leave me lonely and unfulfilled. I turned down the promotion. The decision felt like dying a little inside, but Marcus's relief was so palpable, his gratitude so overwhelming, that I convinced myself I'd made the right choice. He planned a special weekend getaway to celebrate my wisdom in prioritizing our relationship, and I tried to ignore the voice in my head that screamed I just betrayed everything I'd worked for. That weekend was when I first began to see the cracks in Marcus's carefully constructed facade. We were staying at a bed and breakfast in wine country, one of those picturesque places with rooms that cost more per night than I used to spend on groceries in a week. Marcus had planned every detail, from the restaurant reservations to the winery tours, and I was expected to be grateful for his thoughtfulness. But when the server at dinner was friendly and chatty, making recommendations and sharing stories about the local area, Marcus's mood shifted in a way I'd never seen before. His smile became tight and forced, his responses clipped and dismissive. After the server walked away, Marcus leaned across the table and whispered that the man was obviously flirting with me and how embarrassing it was to watch me encourage him by being so responsive and animated. I was stunned. The server had been professional and personable, nothing more, and I'd simply been polite in return. But Marcus's interpretation of the interaction was so different from my own experience that I began to question what had actually happened. Had I been flirting without realizing it? Was my friendliness inappropriate? The doubt he planted grew throughout the evening, making me self-conscious about every interaction with restaurant staff, hotel employees, and other guests that night. In our room, Marcus made love to me with an intensity that felt different from usual. More possessive, more demanding, as if he was marking territory or proving a point. Afterward, as I lay awake listening to his breathing, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I was sharing a bed with someone who claimed to love me more than anything, yet I felt completely isolated, cut off from my own instincts and perceptions. The next morning, Marcus was back to his charming, attentive self, bringing me coffee in bed and planning our day with enthusiastic detail. The previous evening's tension seemed forgotten, and I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing or blown it out of proportion. This became another pattern, moments of uncomfortable clarity, followed by Marcus's return to loving behavior that made me question my own reactions and memories. The questioning of my own reality became a constant companion. Marcus never directly contradicted my memories or experiences, but he had a way of reframing them that left me feeling confused and uncertain about my own perceptions. When I mentioned feeling hurt by something he'd said, he'd express surprise and concern, wondering if I'd misunderstood his tone or missed the context that made his words caring rather than critical. "I'm worried about you, Sarah," he'd say, his voice full of genuine sounding concern. "You seem to be interpreting things so negatively lately. I wonder if you're getting enough sleep, or if work stress is affecting how you're processing conversations. I love you so much, and it breaks my heart to see you upset over misunderstandings." These conversations left me feeling crazy and ungrateful. Here was this man who loved me, who was patient with my apparent oversensitivity, who remained kind and supportive, even when I was being unreasonable. The problem, he suggested gently, wasn't his behavior, but my perception of it. I was stressed, tired, maybe even a little depressed. and these factors were distorting my ability to recognize love and care when I saw it. I started keeping a journal, thinking that writing down my thoughts and feelings might help me sort through the confusion. But even my private reflections became contaminated with doubt. I'd write about feeling controlled or criticized, then read it back and wonder if I was being unfair. Marcus's voice had become so embedded in my internal dialogue that I couldn't trust my own thoughts and feelings. Anymore. The isolation became more complete as I stopped confiding in friends and family about my relationship concerns. How could? I explained that my boyfriend was emotionally abusive when he never yelled, never threatened, never even seemed angry. How could I articulate the feeling of being controlled by someone who presented every limitation as concern for my well-being? When people asked how things were going, I found myself parroting Marcus's version of our relationship. We were deeply in love, perfectly compatible, planning a beautiful future together. My family noticed changes in me during visits, but when they expressed concern, I defended Marcus passionately. I couldn't bear for them to think poorly of him when he was so good to me, so devoted and caring. Their questions felt like attacks on the only stable thing in my increasingly unstable world, and I began visiting less frequently to avoid their worried glances and carefully phrased inquiries about my happiness. The physical symptoms started about 2 years into the relationship. I developed chronic headaches that no doctor could explain, stomach problems that came and went without apparent cause, and a persistent exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. My doctor ran tests, checked my thyroid, suggested I might need more iron or vitamin D. Everything came back normal, which somehow made me feel even more broken and defective. Marcus was wonderfully supportive during this period, driving me to medical appointments, researching potential causes for my symptoms, bringing me soup when my stomach acted up. He suggested that stress might be the culprit, pointing out how much pressure I put on myself at work and how I tended to worry about things beyond my control. He encouraged me to consider whether my job was worth sacrificing my health, whether the demands of my career were sustainable given my physical and emotional well-being. The idea that my symptoms might be stress-related wasn't entirely wrong, but Marcus's proposed solution was always the same: simplify my life by reducing external pressures and focusing on our relationship. Every doctor's visit that yielded no concrete diagnosis became evidence that I was pushing myself too hard, trying to maintain a lifestyle that was fundamentally incompatible with my sensitive nature. I began calling in sick more frequently, using my mysterious health issues as justification for avoiding social commitments and work responsibilities that felt overwhelming. Marcus would take care of me on these days, bringing me tea and movies, creating a cocoon of comfort that felt like sanctuary but was actually another form of prison. I was becoming dependent on his care, unable to function independently, increasingly convinced that I was too fragile for the demands of normal adult life. The worst part was that some of my symptoms were real. The constant state of hypervigilance, the need to monitor Marcus's moods and adjust my behavior accordingly, the exhaustion of doubting every thought and feeling I had, all of this was genuinely making me sick. But I couldn't see the connection between my deteriorating health and the emotional environment I was living in. Instead, I accepted Marcus's explanation that I was simply someone who needed extra care and protection from life's stresses. My world contracted further as I used my health as an excuse to avoid activities that might challenge Marcus's version of reality or expose me to perspectives that contradicted his carefully constructed narrative about our relationship. Asterisk. The engagement happened during one of my lowest periods. I'd been battling a particularly bad bout of stomach problems and had taken several days off work, spending most of my time in bed feeling nauseous and weak. Marcus had been incredibly attentive, working from home to take care of me, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for his devotion. He proposed on a quiet evening when I was finally feeling well enough to sit up and eat something. There were no grand gestures or elaborate plans, just Marcus getting down on one knee in our living room, tears in his eyes as he told me how much he loved me and wanted to spend his life taking care of me. The ring was beautiful, exactly what I would have chosen if I'd been able to articulate my preferences, which somehow felt like further proof of how well he knew and understood me. I said yes, of course. How could I say no to someone who'd been so patient with my health issues, so supportive during my struggles, so completely devoted to my well-being? The engagement felt like a reward for surviving whatever was wrong with me, validation that I was lovable despite being so high maintenance and difficult. Planning the wedding became another source of subtle control disguised as care. Marcus had opinions about everything: the venue, the guest list, the dress. The menu, always framed as wanting the day to be perfect for me. When I suggested inviting some college friends I hadn't seen in years, he worried that I might feel overwhelmed by trying to catch up with so many people on such an important day. When I showed him a dress I loved, he gently suggested that a different style might be more flattering for my body type and the formal tone we were setting. Every decision became a negotiation where Marcus's preferences ultimately won out, but always through a process that made me feel like I was being protected from making choices I'd later regret. He was the expert on what would make me happy, what would reduce my stress, what would create the perfect day for both of us. My own instincts and desires seemed unreliable compared to his thoughtful analysis of every option. The guest list grew smaller as Marcus expressed concerns about various people on my initial list. Some friends might bring drama or negative energy. Some family members might cause stress with their drinking or inappropriate comments. Some colleagues might make the event feel too much like work. Each elimination felt reasonable in isolation, but collectively they resulted in a wedding that felt more like Marcus's vision than mine. The wedding day itself was beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Everything looked perfect: the flowers, the venue, the carefully curated guest list of people who posed no threat to Marcus's narrative about our relationship. I felt like I was watching someone else's wedding, playing the role of the happy bride while feeling completely disconnected from the experience. During the ceremony, as I looked into Marcus's eyes and repeated vows about love and honor and commitment, I had a moment of startling clarity. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt genuinely happy, the last time I'd laughed without calculating whether my response was appropriate, the last time I'd expressed an opinion without first considering how Marcus might react. Standing there in my beautiful dress, surrounded by carefully selected guests, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life, but the moment passed quickly, swept away by the momentum of the day and Marcus's radiant happiness. His joy felt so pure and overwhelming that I convinced myself my doubts were just wedding nerves. The natural anxiety that comes with making such a big commitment. Everyone looked so pleased, so convinced that we were perfect together, that I pushed my concerns aside and focused on playing my part in the celebration. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Italy, a trip Marcus had planned down to the smallest detail. He'd researched restaurants, mapped out walking tours, even learned some basic Italian phrases to help us navigate. His thoughtfulness should have felt romantic, but instead it felt suffocating. There was no room for spontaneity, no opportunity for me to discover anything on my own or express preferences that hadn't been anticipated and incorporated into his plan. I suggested deviating from the itinerary to explore a market we'd stumbled across. Marcus's disappointment was immediate and palpable. He'd spent so much time researching the best experiences for us, he explained. and he was worried that random exploration might lead us to tourist traps or unsafe areas. His concern felt reasonable, but it also felt like another door closing, another opportunity for independent thought or action being gently but firmly eliminated. I spent much of the honeymoon feeling like a passenger in my own life, going through the motions of being a happy newlywed while feeling increasingly disconnected from my own experiences and desires. The beautiful cities, the incredible food, the romantic settings, all of it felt muted and distant, as if I was experiencing it through a thick layer of glass that separated me from any genuine emotion or pleasure. Coming home from the honeymoon marked the beginning of the most suffocating period of our relationship. As Marcus's wife, I found that his protective instincts intensified, and the gentle control he'd exercised over my choices became more explicit and comprehensive. It was still presented as love and care, but the boundaries around my autonomy grew narrower and more absolute. He began monitoring my spending more closely, not by taking away my credit cards or controlling my access to money, but by expressing concern about my financial decisions and suggesting that we review purchases together to make sure we were being responsible with our shared resources. Large purchases required discussion, which somehow always ended with Marcus's perspective taking precedence. Small purchases were subject to gentle questioning that made me feel guilty for buying things he deemed unnecessary or impractical. My social media use became another source of his concern. He worried about my privacy and safety online, pointing out how easy it would be for strangers to track my location or for employers to make judgments based on photos or posts. He suggested I adjust my privacy settings, be more careful about what I shared, consider whether certain photos or comments might be misinterpreted. Gradually, I stopped posting entirely, finding it easier to avoid his worried questions than to defend my desire to share moments from my life. The few friendships I'd managed to maintain became increasingly difficult to sustain. Marcus never forbade me from seeing friends, but his anxiety whenever I made plans was so intense that I began canceling more often than not. He would pace while I got ready, reminding me to be careful and to call if I needed anything. His worry so palpable that I felt guilty for leaving him alone with his concerns about my safety and well-being. When I did manage to spend time with friends, their observations about changes in my personality became harder to dismiss. Emma, my oldest friend, finally confronted me directly during the rare lunch date, telling me that she was worried about how quiet and anxious I'd become. She said I seemed like a shadow of my former self, constantly checking my phone and cutting conversations short to get home to Marcus. Her words hit me like a physical blow because they matched the growing awareness I'd been trying to suppress. I was different, fundamentally changed in ways that had nothing to do with natural growth or maturity. I'd been diminished, reduced to a pale imitation of who I used to be, and the process had been so gradual and subtle that I participated in my own disappearance without even realizing it was happening. That conversation with Emma marked the beginning of my awakening, though it would be months before I could fully acknowledge what was happening to me. I started paying closer attention to my interactions with Marcus, trying to identify the specific moments when I felt myself shrinking or doubting my own perceptions. The awareness was painful and confusing because Marcus's behavior remained consistently loving and concerned. He never raised his voice, never made threats, never displayed the obvious signs of abuse that would have made it easier to recognize what was happening. Instead, he used disappointment, worry, and gentle correction to shape my behavior and thinking. Every boundary he established was presented as protection, every criticism as guidance, every limitation as evidence of how much he cared about my well-being. I began to see how he used my own empathy and desire to please against me. Because I loved him and wanted him to be happy, I was willing to adjust my behavior to avoid causing him distress. Because I trusted his judgment and believed he knew me better than I knew myself, I accepted his interpretations of my experiences over my own. Because I wanted to be a good wife, I prioritized his needs and preferences even when they conflicted with my own desires. Realization that I was being manipulated was terrifying and disorienting. If Marcus wasn't deliberately trying to control me, if his behavior stemmed from genuine love and concern, then what did that say about the nature of our relationship? If he was consciously manipulating me, then everything I believed about our love was a lie. Either possibility felt devastating and impossible to accept. I started researching emotional abuse online, reading articles and forum posts about psychological manipulation and control. The descriptions matched my experience so perfectly that I felt simultaneously validated and horrified. Other people had lived through similar relationships, had struggled with the same confusion and self-doubt, had felt the same gradual erosion of their identity and autonomy. But even with this new awareness, leading felt impossible. Marcus was my husband, my primary support system, the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world. The thought of dismantling our life together, of facing the world alone after years of being told I was too sensitive and fragile to handle stress, felt overwhelming and terrifying. The first time I seriously considered leaving was after Marcus's reaction to a job opportunity that came up unexpectedly. A former colleague reached out about a position at her new company, something that would represent a significant step forward in my career and require relocating to another city. When I mentioned it to Marcus, his response was immediate and devastating. He didn't forbid me from considering the opportunity, but he talked extensively about how difficult long-distance relationships were, how much he'd worry about me in a new city without support systems, how career success wasn't worth sacrificing our marriage. He became emotional, crying as he talked about how lost he'd be without me, how empty our home would feel, how he didn't think he could survive being separated from the person he loved more than life itself. His pain felt so genuine and overwhelming that I found myself comforting him instead of discussing the opportunity. But something had shifted in me during that conversation. For the first time, I clearly saw how Marcus's emotional responses were used to control my choices. His tears and devastation weren't just expressions of love. They were tools to ensure that his needs took precedence over my ambitions and desires. Didn't take the job, but I also didn't dismiss it immediately as I would have in the past. Instead, I called my sister for the first time in months and found myself talking about the opportunity and Marcus's reaction. Hearing myself describe the situation out loud was revelatory. I sounded like someone asking permission to pursue her own career, someone who believed her husband's comfort was more important than her professional growth. My sister was gentle but direct in her response. She reminded me of who I used to be before Marcus, the ambitious, confident woman who pursued opportunities without needing anyone's permission or approval. She asked questions that made me uncomfortable. When was the last time I'd made a major decision without considering Marcus's reaction first? When had I stopped talking about my own dreams and goals? When had my life become entirely about managing someone else's emotions and needs? These conversations with my sister became a lifeline over the following weeks. She didn't push me to leave Marcus or tell me what to do, but she consistently reflected back to me the person I'd been before him, reminding me of my own strength and capability. Slowly, I began to remember what it felt like to trust my own judgment and prioritize my own needs. The decision to leave didn't come all at once. It was a gradual process of reclaiming small pieces of myself, testing my ability to make independent choices, and rebuilding trust in my own perceptions and instincts. I started with tiny acts of rebellion, buying a book Marcus would disapprove of, taking a different route home from work, expressing opinions in conversations without first gauging. His reaction to each small act of independence felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I was rediscovering parts of myself that had been dormant for so long I'd forgotten they existed. The woman who used to have strong opinions about politics and art and literature began to emerge from the careful, neutral persona I developed. To avoid Marcus's subtle corrections and guidance, I began saving money secretly, opening a separate account that Marcus didn't know about. The process felt like planning an escape from prison, which I suppose it was in many ways. I researched apartments in different neighborhoods, looked into jobs that would allow me to support myself independently, made lists of belongings that were truly mine versus things we'd acquired together. The hardest part was acknowledging that the love I believed in so completely was actually a sophisticated form of control. Marcus did love me, but it was a possessive, consuming love that required me to disappear in order to exist within it. He loved the version of me that he'd created through years of careful manipulation, the woman who existed primarily to validate his needs and desires. Planning my departure while continuing to live with Marcus required a level of deception that felt foreign and uncomfortable. I had to pretend everything was normal while secretly preparing to leave. Had to maintain the facade of a happy marriage while researching divorce lawyers and apartment rentals. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but it was also empowering to realize I was capable of protecting myself and planning for my own future. When I finally told Marcus I was leaving, his reaction was everything I'd expected and feared. He didn't become violent or threatening, but his emotional manipulation intensified to a degree that was almost theatrical. He cried, begged, promised to change, accused me of abandoning him during a difficult time at work, suggested I was having some kind of breakdown that was preventing me from thinking clearly. The weeks following my announcement were the most challenging of the entire relationship. Marcus alternated between desperate attempts to convince me to stay and subtle punishments designed to make leaving seem impossible. He would be incredibly loving and attentive one day, reminding me of all the good times we'd shared and how perfect we were together, then distant and cold the next, making me feel guilty for hurting someone who loved me so much. He questioned my decision-making capacity, suggesting that the stress of recent months had affected my judgment and that I wasn't thinking clearly about the consequences of destroying our marriage. He reminded me of how much I'd struggled with independence in the past, how my health issues had improved under his care, how difficult it would be for me to manage on my own given my sensitive nature and tendency toward anxiety. These conversations were designed to undermine my confidence in my ability to survive without him, and they were partially effective. I did feel scared about living alone after years of having every decision filtered through Marcus's perspective. I worried that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I was giving up the best thing in my life because of some misguided notion of independence that would ultimately leave me lonely and regretful. But I also remembered Emma's words about becoming a shadow of myself, and I held on to that image as motivation to move forward with my plans. Even if leaving Marcus meant making mistakes or facing difficulties I couldn't anticipate, it also meant having the opportunity to make those mistakes myself, to learn from them and grow in ways that weren't possible within the confines of our relationship. The practical aspects of separation were complicated by Marcus's continued attempts to maintain control through seemingly helpful gestures. He offered to help me find an apartment to handle the division of our belongings, to manage the financial aspects of our separation in ways that would be easiest for me. Each offer was presented as evidence of how much he cared about my well-being, but I recognized them as attempts to remain involved in my decision-making process. I declined his help and handled everything independently, which felt both empowering and terrifying. making decisions about where to live and how to divide our shared possessions without Marcus's input was like using muscles that had atrophied from lack of use. Everything felt difficult and unfamiliar, but it also felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that had been lost for years, moving into. My own apartment was like stepping into an alternate universe where I was allowed to exist as myself without modification or approval. The silence I'd feared turned out to be peaceful rather than lonely, a space where my own thoughts and feelings could exist without being questioned or reinterpreted by someone else. The first few weeks were difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd become so accustomed to considering Marcus's reactions to everything that making simple decisions felt overwhelming. What to eat for dinner, what to watch on television, how to spend weekend time, these choices had been filtered through Marcus's preferences for so long that I'd lost touch with my own desires and inclinations. But gradually, I began to remember who I was before Marcus reshaped me to fit his vision of the perfect partner. I started wearing colors I hadn't worn in years, reading books he would have found frivolous or inappropriate, reconnecting with friends I distanced myself from during the relationship. Each small act of self-determination felt like a victory, proof that I was capable of independent thought and action. The physical symptoms that had plagued me during the marriage began to disappear almost immediately. The chronic headaches, stomach problems, and persistent exhaustion that no doctor could explain evaporated once. I was no longer living in a constant state of hypervigilance and self-monitoring. My body had been trying to tell me what my mind couldn't acknowledge, that the environment I was living in was making me sick. Marcus continued to contact me regularly, alternating between expressions of love and concern for my well-being and subtle attempts to undermine my confidence in my decision to leave. He would text about practical matters like mail that had been delivered to our old address, then slide into emotional manipulation about how much he missed me and how empty the house felt without me. I began to see these communications clearly for what they were: attempts to maintain connection and control, even after I'd physically removed myself from his influence. Each message was designed to make me question my decision, to remind me of his supposed love and devotion, to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to thrive independently. It's been 3 months since I moved into this apartment, and I'm still discovering pieces of myself that I thought were lost forever. The woman who used to have strong opinions about everything is slowly returning, along with the ability to trust my own perceptions and make decisions based on my own needs and desires, rather than someone else's emotional reactions. I'm in therapy now, working with someone who specializes in emotional abuse and psychological manipulation. It's been helpful to have a professional validate my experiences and help me understand the sophisticated techniques Marcus used to maintain control while appearing loving and supportive. I'm learning about trauma bonding, gaslighting, and coercive control, terms I'd never heard before, but that perfectly describe the dynamics of my marriage. The healing process is slower than I expected, but it's also more profound. I'm not just recovering from a bad relationship. I'm rebuilding my entire sense of self and learning to trust my own judgment after years of having it systematically undermined. Some days are harder than others, when I feel overwhelmed by the freedom to make my own choices, or when I miss the false security of having someone else make decisions for me. But mostly, I feel like I'm waking up from a long, confusing dream where I'd forgotten who I was and what I wanted from life. The colors seem brighter now, food tastes better, conversations with friends feel more genuine and connected. I'm remembering what it feels like to laugh without calculating whether my response is appropriate, to express opinions without fear of disappointment or correction. Marcus still contacts me occasionally, usually during what he considers significant dates or when something happens that he thinks I should know about. His messages are always carefully crafted to seem caring and appropriate, but I can now see the manipulation tactics embedded within them. The ability to recognize his techniques for what they are feels like a superpower protection against ever falling into that trap again. I know I have more healing to do, more pieces of myself to rediscover and reclaim. But for the first time in years, I'm genuinely excited about my future and the person I'm becoming. They never hit me, but they broke me in ways that felt more devastating than any physical violence could have been. The invisible wounds are healing, now, slowly but surely, and I'm learning that breaking free from someone who claims to love, you can be the most loving thing you ever do for yourself. The woman I am today would recognize the red flags that the mid-is 24-year-old me missed completely. She would trust her instincts when something felt wrong, even if she couldn't articulate exactly what it was. She would understand that love doesn't require you to disappear, that healthy relationships make you feel more like yourself, not less, sometimes. I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd convinced myself that Marcus's version of love was enough, that being cared for was more important than being free. I think I would have continued to fade until there was nothing left of the original Sarah. Just a carefully constructed shell designed to meet someone else's needs and expectations. Instead, I'm here in my small apartment with its mismatched furniture and walls I painted whatever colors made me happy, rebuilding a life that belongs entirely to me. I'm learning to love the sound of my own voice again, the strength of my own opinions, the validity of my own experiences and perceptions. The scars are invisible, but so is the strength I've discovered in the process of healing. They never hit me, but they broke me anyway. And in putting myself back together, I've become someone stronger, wiser, and more authentically myself than I ever was before. The breaking was devastating, but the rebuilding has been the most beautiful thing I've ever done.